What's up guys, Asian here again with another build video, and today we're going to be going over the Stamina Warden DPS. Not much has changed for the Stamina Warden compared to Dragonhold. While Wardens did get a new passive 10% additional crit damage when you deal chilled, or after 10% critical damage after chilled is applied to an enemy. Stamina Wardens don't really have a way to apply chill to an enemy, so that passive doesn't really benefit us too much, unless of course we're in a mixed group with some other source of chilled coming from our group, in which case Stamina Wardens did get a small buff that way. 10% crit damage is definitely not something to turn your nose to, so we did get a small damage buff in group scenarios, not necessarily in a solo 21 million enemy parse kind of scenario. So this build is pretty much going to be more or less identical to what you saw in Dragonhold, maybe a few minor tweaks here and there just to optimize rotation perhaps, but other than that, pretty similar to what you've seen in Dragonhold. Like the rest of our build videos, no gear in this video. We won't be going over that. That's covered in the stamina gear video, which will be popping up in the upper right hand corner right about now. Things like race and gear, those are all covered in that video. So go ahead and check that video out if you want to know what gear you should be running or what your attribute distribution should be, your CPs, and then come back here for the skills and the demonstration of the rotation that you're going to be doing for Stamina Warden. So let's go ahead and get started here with our skills here, starting off with our front bar. Nothing has really changed between Dragonhold and now, like I mentioned earlier, so we're still running the same bars here. So Cutting Dive, Subterranean Assaults, Whirling Blades, Barbed Trap, Camouflage Hunter, and Wild Guardian. We're still very reliant on that bear for our overall DPS, but we're not quite as reliant as, say, the Magicka Warden. So we can still run things like Flawless Dawnbreaker on the front bar and Ballista on the back bar and not lose that much DPS, but running the bear is going to give us the most amount of damage, assuming that the bear is not going to be finicky in that particular fight. And there are some fights where the bear is not going to be the best option. Then for our back bar, we're still running Consuming Trap, Poison Injection. We're running Endless Hail because we're running the Maelstrom Bow now. Then we have Barbed Trap again for just additional weapon damage. Then we have Bull Netch for some additional Stamina Sustain. If you don't need the Stamina Sustain, in an actual raid environment you probably won't need it because you have a lot of sources of Sustain. Then you can drop this for some other ability here. Then we have Wild Guardian, again, as our ultimate here. And same thing here for our front bar. We're running Camouflage Hunter for the weapon damage bonus. It does have a nice secondary effect of giving us Minor Berserk when we crit from a flank, but that's not always going to be the case. We won't always be able to make use of this additional secondary effect, so you can replace this with some other ability if you so desire. The other abilities you could replace that with, Growing Swarm, Bird of Prey. Both have their uses. Growing Swarm is a dot which also applies minor vulnerability. It also is a AoE dot, kind of. It's fairly weak. 16-12 physical damage every 2 seconds, rounds up to about 800 DPS. Not great for an AoE dot, but it's still an AoE dot nonetheless, but you'd probably be running it more for the secondary effect, the minor vulnerability, even though a healer should be covering that for you. Then we have Bird of Prey, which is nice because while it's slotted, you always have Minor Berserk. So if you're in a situation where you're not getting good Combat Prayer uptime, say you're running Asylum as a Stamina Warden for whatever reason, you can run and slot Bird of Prey to make sure you always have that Minor Berserk. Even if you have good Combat Prayer uptime, it still might be worth slotting Bird of Prey, so that way you know you're always going to have Minor Berserk, at least on one of your bars. Beyond that, under not much here. Dual wield, not much to talk about. Bow, again, not much to talk about here. Under the armor line, you can get major evasion by running Elude or Shuffle, which reduces damage from AoE attacks by 25%, which is actually covers quite a bunch of abilities in Trials and Dungeons. A lot of your damage is coming from AoE attacks, so getting the additional major evasion, additional 25% mitigation, is actually pretty strong in PvE environments. Beyond that, you can, whenever I had a Fire Guild's ability, except for Barbed Trap on the front bar, you can pretty much replace it with any of the other 3 Fighter's Guild abilities. So Silver Shard, for example, for some cleave damage. Silver Leash if you want to help pull things in, but you shouldn't really be doing that as a DPS. Ring of Preservation gives you a pretty decent heal and a minor protection, so just additional mitigation that way. Under the Undaunted line, Shadow Silk is nice to if you're running like a Bobo build, or even just as a melee build. It could be beneficial to run this for the Black Widow synergy to help out your other DPS. And that's pretty much cover. No, if you want another self-heal, Alliance War line, you can have Echoing Vigor. I prefer Echoing Vigor over Resolving Vigor because Echoing Vigor can stack with other sources of Echoing Vigor. So if you have like 3 or 4 Echoing Vigors going on, because you have a bunch of stamina DPS, that'll give you more healing done per second compared to if all of you were just running Resolving Vigor. So definitely recommend Echoing instead. But yeah, that pretty much covers it for all the skills here. But generally speaking, you might not even need Echoing Vigor because you do get health back whenever you use Cutting Dive here under the Bond with Nature. So you do get some health back every time you use Cutting Dive. So you might not necessarily need to use Echoing Vigor. It just gives you another heal over time, another source in case you can't use these sort of abilities. But now let's go ahead and talk about the rotation. Rotation hasn't changed anything, if at all. It's still going to be Subterranean Assault, 2 abilities, Subterranean Assault, 2 abilities. So, again, not that big of a change between Dragonhold and Harrowstorm. That passive bonus, the 10% additional crit damage, you're relying on other people in order to get that. So nothing that you can do to really help proc that additional crit damage, for example. And rotation's fairly simple, like the pre-buff with Bull Netch and your Source of Minor Fracture. I just put down all of my backbar dots first. And do 2 abilities. That does include the Bear Ultimate, so you can do Bear Ultimate like that. And just re-up your backbar dots. Note that you will need to do a lot of bar swapping. So your backbar rotation is going to be split up a little bit here. Damage seems kind of low, so I think I might have forgotten to save my CP. Yeah, still running on different CPs, so I'm gonna really quickly readjust my CPs for you. Then we will go ahead and do our parse here. I am missing. Go. Alright, so that pretty much covers it for the rotation. Now we're going to do a 12-man dummy parse. You guys get an idea of the actual DPS we're able to pull on a stamina warden. Now I am going to be using the bear ultimate here. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but the bear can be a little bit finicky in an actual raid environment. Because the bear is a pet, it needs to follow the boss around when it attacks. And while the bear movement is pretty fast, it's not instantaneous. It's not like it teleports around. So for bosses that are teleporting around, for example, while the bear is traveling, it's not doing any damage. So you're getting damage lost that way. The dragons in Sunspire, Crushing Swipe won't hit the dragons. So you're missing basically half of your bear DPS that way. So the bear is not going to be perfect. It's not the best ultimate to run in every single situation. So just be mindful of that. So if you want to run the bear, you can. You certainly can. I'm not going to say you can't. But if you are not in a situation, if you're in a situation where you can't run the bear, then in terms of ultimates, what I recommend running for ultimates would be to run Flawless Dawnbreaker as your front bar ultimate here, or it's the back bar ultimate. As your front bar ultimate here, and then for your back bar ultimate, run the Ballista ultimate here, like so. So you have Ballista on the back bar, and this is the ultimate you would be using. Then you have Flawless Dawnbreaker on the front bar for additional weapon damage. You could also run Flawless Dawnbreaker as your main ultimate if you want some additional cleave damage. You also get a pretty good burst of weapon damage as well, so it might be worth using Flawless Dawnbreaker as your ultimate if you're not able to run the bear as your primary ultimate of choice. The bear, if it works properly, is going to give you the highest DPS potential. So the Squamble and Demi Parse, a couple of caveats here. First of all, it is not necessarily representative of your actual in-raid Parse performance. That's because the Trial Dummy is missing a few debuffs, so things like Martial Knowledge, Zens. You're missing a couple of sustain bonuses like Symphony of Blaze, Master's Restoration Staff, that you're not going to that you would be getting in an actual raid environment. So DPS is going to be a little bit different here compared to in an actual raid. Not to mention the whole issues with the bear if you are running the bear, so your DPS is going to be noticeably lower if your bear is going to be playing weird games with you, for example. So the Swarm and Demi Parse is more accurate way to kind of compare to different classes rather than a strict raid proxy, for example. The one thing I forgot to mention is that once we get to around 30 or 33% health, you're going to want to use Whirling Blades rather than Cutting Dive. You can use the Cutting Dive if you know Off Balance is active in order to get the additional bleed. That being said, that does require you to micromanage a little bit here, so it might just be better just to continue to spam Whirling Blades, but if you want, and you're really paying attention to when Off Balance is active, when you see Off Balance being active, you can return back to Cutting Dive to get the additional bleed damage there. So let's go ahead and get started with this Parse. We are using Maarselok, so I am going to be bashing. Rotation itself, the core concept behind the rotation is fairly straightforward. It's the execution that trips people up. Once you know the kind of core concept, the rotation itself is relatively straightforward, if a bit confusing. I will mention here that we might need to heavy attack a few times here. We'll try not to, but Warden sustain is not necessarily the greatest. Do you need to heavy attack at all? Heavy attack, one ability, and then do shulks. Basically, your heavy attack acts as a second, as an ability. Like so. At this point, we're going to start using Whirling Blades. And this is when you're going to really start seeing the sustain hit. This is where you're probably going to start heavy attacking. Alright, so there you go. That is the Stamina Warden DPS. That's L. Okay, so being pulled back in combat. Well, just shy of 80.5k. Stamina Wardens are not in a great place right now when it comes to DPS. Part of it is the fact that we are relying on the bear, and the bear can be a little bit finicky in the best of times. But it's also just our rotation itself is a little bit tricky, and our sustain is not that great. As you saw, we did have to do quite a few heavy attacks in order to fully sustain a light attack rotation. In actual raid, it should be a little bit better. We shouldn't need to light attack or heavy attack quite as often, but it's still a little bit challenging to maintain a full light attack rotation as a Stamina Warden. So in terms of standard DPS, Stamina Wardens are definitely one of the worst classes when it comes to overall damage output. That being said, 80.5k is still plenty respectable, and it should be enough to get you into pretty much any guild in the game that's doing sort of vet DLC, hard mode trials, or anything like that. So you can still clear all the content in the game, you're just not going to be as strong as like a Stamina Templar or a Stamina Necromancer. But that concludes this build video. If you guys have any questions at all about the build, feel free to leave them down in the comment section below, and I will try to answer them to the best of my ability. Hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.